Wars are usually messy, complicated things. They're fought over land, over crowns, over religion, and sometimes over ideas too abstract for anyone to fully understand. But every now and then, history gives us a war so absurd, so hilariously petty, that it makes you wonder if human beings were ever meant to rule themselves at all. Welcome to Italy in the year 1325. A time when knights clashed in armor, when banners of rival cities flew proudly on the battlefield, and when the destiny of thousands of men was decided over a wooden bucket. Yes, you heard that correctly. Not a jewel-encrusted crown, not a relic of the saints, not even a chest of gold. A bucket. Plain, ordinary, wooden, pulled from a well. And yet, this bucket was enough to send tens of thousands of men charging into battle, swords raised, lances lowered, armor gleaming in the sun. The story has gone down in history as the War of the Oaken Bucket, and it is, without question, one of the strangest wars Europe ever managed to stage. A tale that sounds like a joke. If you're shaking your head right now, you're not alone. Even medieval chroniclers admitted that the whole thing sounded like satire. Imagine reading a history book filled with grand tales of empires and kings, and then suddenly finding, and then, of course, there was that time Bologna and Modena fought a full-scale war over a stolen bucket. But here's the thing, as ridiculous as it sounds, the war was very real. Real knights, real bloodshed, real armies, real consequences. And at the center of it all, a humble wooden bucket, the kind you or I would barely notice if it sat in a corner. Italy in 1325. To understand why a bucket mattered so much, you have to picture Italy at the time. Unlike today, Italy wasn't a unified country. It was a patchwork of fiercely independent city-states: Milan, Florence, Venice, Bologna, Modena, and dozens more. Each had its own government, its own army, and, more importantly, its own grudges. The biggest divide was between two rival factions, the Guelphs and the Ghibellines. The Guelphs backed the Pope in Rome. The Ghibellines supported the Holy Roman Emperor. This wasn't just political philosophy, it was a blood feud that tore families and cities apart. To say you were a Guelph or a Ghibelline was to declare your loyalties, your enemies, and your future in one breath. Bologna, a proud and wealthy city, was staunchly Guelph. Modena, its smaller neighbor, was firmly Ghibelline. They were only about 20 miles apart, close enough to glare at each other across fields and trade routes. And for decades, they fought, raiding, skirmishing, plotting, hating. The pettiest spark in history, and then, in late 1325, a group of Modenese soldiers carried out a raid into Bolognese territory. Raids like this were common, a way to humiliate your rival, steal supplies, and prove your dominance. But on this particular raid, they decided to take a very unusual trophy, a wooden bucket from a public well in Bologna. It was nothing special, just a bucket used to draw water. But in the hands of the Modenese, it became a symbol. They paraded it around like a prize, a giant middle finger to their hated neighbors. When Bologna demanded it back, Modena refused. Of course they refused. The bucket was a humiliation too sweet to give up. And Bologna, pride-stung, decided this could not stand. So they raised an army. A massive one. Over 30,000 men marched under Bologna's banner, determined to recover their stolen property. All for a bucket. The absurdity sinks in. Pause for a moment and let that number sink in. 30,000 men, armed, armored, supplied, marching not for territory, not for a crown, but for a bucket. You can almost imagine the soldiers muttering as they trudged along, "So, what exactly are we fighting for?" The Modenese stole a bucket. A bucket. Like, for water. Yes. Shut up and keep marching. History doesn't record what the average soldier thought of this cause, but we can guess. They probably didn't care. They weren't there for the bucket. They were there because their lords told them to be, because honor and faction demanded it. But the symbol mattered. And in medieval Italy, symbols were everything. Setting the stage for battle, the Modenese, realizing Bologna was out for blood, gathered their own army. It was much smaller, about 7,000 men, but Modena's troops were experienced, well organized, and fiercely motivated. The two sides prepared for a clash near the village of Zappolino, just outside Bologna's territory. The stakes were absurdly petty. but the scale was enormous. This wasn't just a brawl between neighbors, it was war. And at the heart of it all, somewhere safe in Modena, sat a humble oaken bucket, guarded like treasure. And so the stage was set, two rival cities, thousands of armed men, and one of the pettiest sparks in history. In the next section, we'll look closer at the chaos of medieval Italy, the tangled rivalries of Guelphs and Ghibellines that made a stolen bucket enough to ignite a war. Because the truth is, the war wasn't really about the bucket. The bucket was just the excuse. Wars don't really start with buckets. Not even in Italy. The truth is, the War of the Oaken Bucket was just the latest chapter in a centuries-old feud that had already left blood on every cobblestone between the Alps and the Mediterranean. To see how a simple water pail could turn into the spark for thousands of men charging across fields, we have to look at the bigger picture. And the bigger picture was chaos. The patchwork that was Italy in the 14th century was not the unified country we know today. It was a patchwork quilt of fiercely independent city-states. Bologna, Modena, Florence, Milan, Venice, each a power unto itself, each with its own armies, rulers, ambitions, and grudges. These cities were neighbors, but they acted like rival clans living in the same apartment building. Every knock at the door could be war. Trade disputes turned into sieges. Insults turned into bloodshed. If you crossed the wrong border, you might not make it back alive. Guelphs versus Ghibellines. The biggest fault line splitting these cities was the struggle between two mighty powers, the Pope in Rome and the Holy Roman Emperor in Germany. If you backed the Pope, you were a Guelph. If you backed the Emperor, you were a Ghibelline. Now, in theory, this was a battle of ideologies. But in practice, it was an excuse for cities, families, and even drinking buddies to pick sides and start stabbing each other. Imagine modern soccer fandom, but with swords and trebuchets. Entire dynasties were divided. Brothers took opposite sides. Cities flew banners like battle jerseys, cheering for their faction while spilling blood in the streets. And in northern Italy, the divide was sharpest of all. Bologna was proudly Guelph. Modena, just 20 miles away, was stubbornly Ghibelline. That meant every trade route, every toll road, every merchant cart rolling between them was a reason for suspicion. Why Bologna hated Modena? By the early 1300s, Bologna had grown into a powerhouse. It was rich, cultured, and proud, home to one of the oldest universities in Europe, where scholars debated law and philosophy in crowded halls. Bologna saw itself as a leader, a city of prestige. Modena, on the other hand, was smaller, scrappier, and much more militaristic. It wasn't as wealthy, but it had teeth, and it bit often. Modena had long resented Bologna's arrogance, while Bologna sneered at Modena as an upstart nuisance. For decades, the two cities clashed, skirmishes along the border, raids into each other's villages, sieges of castles. It was a feud as old as anyone could remember. So when Modenese raiders yanked a bucket out of a Bolognese well and carried it home, Bologna wasn't just angry about the bucket. They were angry about everything, every insult, every raid, every humiliation going back generations. The bucket was the final straw. Pride and symbolism. You see, in medieval Italy, honor and pride mattered as much as wealth. Sometimes even more. A wooden bucket in a Modenese town square wasn't just a joke. It was a reminder to every merchant, every traveler, every neighbor, Bologna can't even keep its bucket safe. For Bologna, the bucket was a wound to the ego. And when your honor is bruised, you don't just write a letter. You raise an army. And raise an army they did, 30,000 strong. Bologna's confidence versus Modena's cunning. Bologna assumed this would be easy. They were richer, bigger, more prestigious. They had the numbers. To them, it was a simple matter of marching over to Modena, beating their scrappy neighbors into the mud, grabbing the bucket, and going home heroes. But Bologna underestimated Modena. Badly. Modena's army was smaller, but it was made up of hardened fighters, loyal nobles, and mercenaries who knew how to win even when outnumbered. They were fast, organized, and, most importantly, they had something Bologna didn't, the motivation to humiliate their enemy. And when humiliation is the goal, sometimes brains beat brawn. A war waiting to happen. So, really, the war wasn't about the bucket. The bucket was just the spark tossed onto a pile of dry kindling. Bologna and Modena were already waiting for a reason to clash. The factions were too bitter, the egos too swollen, the grudges too sharp. All it took was one wooden bucket to ignite the fire. And that fire would burn brightest at the Battle of Zappalino, the biggest, bloodiest, and most absurd clash of the whole ridiculous war. It was November 1325, and Bologna's leaders were ready to make a statement. They had raised an enormous army, some 30,000 men, the largest force northern Italy had seen in years. To put that in perspective, this wasn't just knights in shining armor. Bologna had assembled every warm body they could find: noblemen, mercenaries, foot soldiers, crossbowmen, farmers with pitchforks, even students from the University of Bologna eager to defend their city's honor. They were confident. With numbers like this, how could scrappy little Modena stand a chance? Modena's underdog army on the other side, Modena could only muster around 7,000 troops. Outnumbered nearly 5 to 1, they had no business even standing in the same field as Bologna. But Modena had a secret weapon. Not a new catapult, not poisoned arrows, not even divine blessing. Their weapon was cunning. Led by the experienced condottieri, mercenary captains who had made careers out of winning against the odds, Modena's troops were tightly disciplined. They knew they couldn't outmuscle Bologna, but they could outthink them. The battlefield at Zappalino, the two armies met near the small village of Zappalino, in the hills outside Modena. It was late autumn, the air was damp, the ground muddy, the perfect recipe for chaos. Bologna's massive force lined up in a proud formation, banners flying, drums pounding, priests blessing the troops. It was supposed to be a show of unstoppable power. And then, Modena attacked. To charge the smaller Modenese force launched a furious surprise assault. Like a wolf pack darting at a lumbering ox, they struck fast and hard. Bologna's giant army, instead of standing firm, panicked. The great unstoppable host crumbled almost instantly. The front lines buckled, soldiers fled in confusion, and what should have been a crushing display of strength turned into a disorganized rout. Imagine a marching band suddenly trying to play football against professionals. That was Bologna at Zappalino. The humiliation, the rout was so complete that Bologna's army didn't just lose the battle, they ran all the way home. Many never even made it back to the city walls. In less than a single day, Modena had utterly humiliated an enemy 4 times its size. And the final insult? After the battle, Modenese troops rode right up to the very gates of Bologna, tore down part of the city's defenses, and dug a ditch just to prove how helpless Bologna was. Then, to top it all off, they planted their stolen bucket on proud display. A glorious victory over a bucket in the annals of military history. There are famous battles like Hastings, Agincourt, and Waterloo. And then there's Zappalino, a full-scale war that started over a bucket, ended in a single afternoon, and left one of Italy's proudest cities humiliated for generations. For Modena, it was the stuff of legend. For Bologna, it was a wound that would never quite heal. The war was over in a single day. Bologna had been trampled, its mighty army scattered like frightened chickens. But the bucket? Oh, the bucket remained in Modena. That little wooden pail, the same one stolen from a well in Bologna, became one of the most prized war trophies in Italian history. A bucket on display, Modena proudly carried the bucket home and placed it in their town hall. Not hidden away, not treated as scrap, but showcased like a holy relic. Imagine walking into the city square and seeing knights and nobles pointing proudly, "Behold, the bucket of our victory." For centuries, that same bucket has been displayed in Modena, carefully preserved like a crown jewel. Visitors still gawk at it today, proof that sometimes, history's greatest treasures aren't made of gold or silver, but of oak and iron. Bologna's shame, and what of Bologna? For them, the bucket wasn't a relic. It was a scar. They had mobilized the greatest army they'd ever fielded, only to lose spectacularly over a petty raid. To admit defeat was to admit that their pride had been shattered by a bucket. So Bologna's official histories tried to downplay it. They insisted the war wasn't really about a bucket, but about politics, factionalism, Guelphs and Ghibellines. And maybe they were right. But it's hard to escape the fact that the bucket became the symbol of their humiliation. A lesson in petty wars. Looking back, the War of the Oaken Bucket is both hilarious and sobering. Hilarious, because it shows how absurdly human our conflicts can be. Cities, armies, thousands of lives lost, over a wooden pail. Sobering, because the truth is, people rarely fight over the object itself. The bucket was just the spark. The real fuel was pride, rivalry, and a refusal to back down. And if you think that sounds silly, consider how many modern feuds, from politics to internet arguments, are really just about buckets in disguise. The bucket lives on to this day. Modena still has the bucket. It sits proudly in the city's Torre della Ghirlandina, a quiet wooden reminder of one of Europe's strangest wars. And maybe that's the true lesson. History remembers battles over crowns and empires, but it also remembers the bucket. Because sometimes, the most ridiculous stories are the ones we can't forget. The War of the Oaken Bucket is one of those strange stories that refuses to be forgotten. It has everything historians love: pride, humiliation, politics, and of course, comedy. Think about it. In a Europe filled with crusades, dynastic struggles, and church schisms, one of the tales that survives in popular memory is a bucket. Not an empire, not a king, not a great invention. A bucket. The symbol of absurdity for centuries, poets and storytellers mocked Bologna and praised Modena. The bucket became a symbol, not of war, but of absurdity. Italian humorists wrote satirical verses about it. Chroniclers slipped sly jokes into their histories. Schoolchildren grew up hearing that Bologna, mighty Bologna, had been bested by a piece of wood. It's the medieval equivalent of being roasted in a meme, and never living it down. From medieval meme to modern legend today, the War of the Oaken Bucket is retold not just in Italian history books, but in classrooms, podcasts, and yes, YouTube videos like this one. It endures because it reminds us of something important. People don't always fight for logical reasons. They fight for pride, identity, and sometimes just because they can't bear to be embarrassed. And when the dust clears, the thing they fought over can seem laughably small. The last laugh. Modena still laughs, of course. Their beloved bucket is still on display, centuries later. Tourists still stop to take photos of it, marveling at how something so ordinary caused so much chaos. Bologna, meanwhile, has long since moved on. But somewhere, deep down, the sting of that humiliation remains. Because history has a cruel sense of humor, it often remembers you not for your victories, but for your most ridiculous defeats. Closing reflection. So the next time you're caught in an argument, remember the War of the Oaken Bucket. Ask yourself, is this really worth going to war over? Or am I just fighting for a bucket? Because if Europe can go to war over a wooden pail, maybe we can laugh at ourselves before things get out of hand.